A few years ago, I made a video talking about the series that I had started but hadn't finished and whether or not I intended on finishing those series, and today I'm finally going to be updating that list. In that video, I was pretty open-ended even for the series I didn't really plan on continuing, but in this one, we're spilling some tea. I'm going to be talking definitively about some series that I do not plan to continue. And when I'm talking about unfinished series, I don't mean that the series itself is not finished, but I personally am not caught up to however far the series has currently gotten, whether or not it is complete. For example, The Rhythmatist by Brandon Sanderson isn't on here because I've read the first book and that's the only one that's out. My list is divided up into 3 sections. Firstly, the series I plan to continue, pretty self-explanatory. Secondly, the ones I'm on the fence about, I've called this the never say never category. And third, and the longest section of the list, are the series that I definitely do not plan to continue. So grab some popcorn, I'm gonna spill some tea, let's jump into the list. So I'm gonna start with the series that I plan to finish, starting with, of course, The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I still haven't read book 3, even though I love this series. I've called it my favorite ongoing series for several years now, and I still haven't caught up to the 3rd book, which came out like 3 years ago at this point. My only excuse is that I haven't been in the mood for it, and I haven't been reading a ton over the past few years, but I really need to get on this because book 4 is probably going to come out next year, and I want to be caught up. Next is The Diviners by Libba Bray, which is especially sad because book 4 came out earlier this year, and I planned to catch up to the series by the time book 4 came out so I could finish the series, and I didn't end up doing that. I've only read the first 2 of the 4 books, but I really enjoyed both of them. This is a series that I've really loved so far, and once again, I just need to finish it because I really like it. Also by Libba Bray, we have the Gemma Doyle trilogy. This is one that I started, I think, again, 3 years ago and just haven't read books 2 and 3 yet, and I need to get on that. Next up is the Lux series, which has 5 books and I've read 3 of them. I like the Lux series, but it's not one that's super high priority for me. It's one that I want to continue and finish eventually, but I don't know when that will be. It probably won't be in the near future, but it is one that I do eventually want to complete. Next up is the Poirot series by Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is one of my favorite authors, and I've been slowly making my way through this series, although I think the last time I read a book in the series was like at the beginning of my booktube channel, so I haven't been doing my due diligence over the past few years, but nonetheless, I do definitely still plan to continue the series and eventually finish it. The last several in this section are all manga, starting with Dead Man Wonderland. I just recently started Dead Man Wonderland, so I'm not exactly sure when I plan to continue it, but I enjoyed the first volume, and so I will definitely be continuing on in the series. Next up is the manga series that's probably highest on my TBR, and that is Monster. I started Monster nearly 4 years ago at this point because it was compared to Death Note, and I obviously love Death Note, but I didn't totally love it. At the time, I thought it was just alright, but over the past couple years, I've really been wanting to return to it because I think I would enjoy it a lot more now, so it's really high up there. I really want to continue it very soon. Next is Your Lie in April. I read the first volume pretty recently, and it's another of the manga series that I want to continue the soonest because I thought the first volume was super cute, really lighthearted and fun, and I enjoyed it. Next up is Future Diary, and like Your Lie in April and Dead Man Wonderland, I recently read the first volume of this and I enjoyed it, so I plan to continue the series and eventually finish the series. And finally, the same goes for the last series in this first section, which is Bleach. The first volume of Bleach was a pleasant surprise, and although it's gonna take me a while to get through it because it's got 74 volumes, it is one that I enjoyed the first volume of and definitely want to continue and eventually finish. Okay, now moving on to the second section of this list, which I decided to call Never Say Never. These are essentially the series that I am considering still continuing, but I'm not totally sure I still want to finish these series for one reason or another, which I'll discuss as we go through them. First up is the Charlie Bone series. This is a middle grade series that I loved as a kid, but I think the last couple of books came out like kind of when I got past the series, so I never actually finished those. And a few years ago, I recollected the entire series, and I've been considering rereading them ever since, but I just never have. So I'm not sure I will ever continue or complete this series, but it's one that's kind of on the back burner that I might come back to eventually. Next up is the Kingkiller Chronicle. This one's a combination of things. Firstly, the third book in the trilogy. Where is it? When is it coming out? Is it ever coming out? I read the first book all the way back at the beginning of my channel in 2015, and there's still no book 3 5 years later. On top of that, it's not something I've been interested in picking up over the past 5 years because of how massive these books are and the third book being nowhere to be found, so I'm really not sure I will ever continue the series despite loving the first book. Next, the one that was already on the bubble a few years ago and is still on the bubble now, The Stormlight Archive. I've enjoyed every single Brandon Sanderson book that I've read, but I'm not sure this series is my thing. I liked book 1, it was really good, but I'm not sure that I care enough to be invested in 10 books that are all 1,000 pages long, especially when only 3 of them are out right now. I don't know if I care that much. I already own book 2, so I can't really say I'm never continuing the series because who knows, but at this point, it's too much of a commitment for me to continue it. Maybe eventually once all the books are out, I might, but as for right now, it's shelved, literally. Next up is the Selection series, and you're probably like, Kristen, why is that not in the absolutely not category because you gave both of the first 2 books horrible ratings? And you're right, but there's a reason that I read the second book after really disliking the first book, and that's because these books are fun to read and make fun of. And so I want to leave that possibility open. I might eventually continue the trilogy and complete the trilogy and never continue on to the spin-off, but I don't know for sure. Given that I haven't continued the series over the past 4 years since I read The Selection, I probably won't, but never say never. Next up is the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. Now, I did unhaul this series from my shelves, so I no longer own it, but it's one that I could see myself eventually possibly returning to because I did enjoy the first book. I just really lost interest in the series in the following months, so I unhauled it. But I could see eventually regaining some sort of interest and maybe checking it out from the library, but as of right now, I don't think that's going to happen. Next in this section is Fullmetal Alchemist, which I own the first several volumes of this, which is why this is in this section, but I didn't totally love the first volume, so I'm not sure I want to continue it. The first volume was fine, but I'm not sure I'm intrigued enough to continue through all 27 volumes of the series. We'll see, but I do own the first 6 volumes, so I could see myself continuing. And lastly, for the Never Say Never section is Carry On. With as much as I loved Carry On, you'd think that I would have been really excited for the release of Wayward Son, but honestly, it's been like 4 years since I read Carry On, and I kind of don't care anymore. When I read it as a standalone. It didn't have a sequel. I don't think there was even talks of there being a sequel. And now there is one, and I'm not sure what to do with it. I don't want to completely rule out reading Wayward Son because I really enjoyed the characters from Carry On, but I just didn't really care when it was released, so I'm not sure I ever will. All right, moving on to section 3, the section you've all been waiting for, the Spilling of the Tea, the series that I do not plan to continue. Is it possible that one day in the future I might change my mind? Sure, but at this point, I have no interest in continuing these series. I know that I mentioned some of these series in the last video that I made like a few years ago talking about this, but past this point, this is the last time I'm going to talk about them in terms of unfinished series. This is their final goodbye, their swan song, I guess. I don't know. First up is The Fade Out. Now, I read the first volume of this because the cover intrigued me. I love that cover. I've said that so many times over the past 5 years. It's one of my favorite covers. And it wasn't just the cover, it was like a cool sounding like film noir crime story. I was intrigued, but I didn't really like it. I still have that volume on my shelves because I love the cover so much and I don't want to get rid of it, but I do not plan on continuing the series at all, ever. Next up is another comic series. There are gonna be several on this list because I just have realized that I'm not big on comic series, and that is the Giant Days comic series. I read the first 4 volumes of this, and I think I even bought volume 5, but I kind of just don't care anymore. I liked it, and I probably liked it better than any other comic series I read, but it's one that I just have lost interest in over the years, and I don't think that I ever will be interested enough in it again to buy what now, at least 10 volumes that are out, I don't think I'm invested that much. Next up is One of Us is Lying. Now, this was a standalone when I read it, and it has since gotten a sequel that I do not plan to read. When I read One of Us is Lying, I liked it but didn't love it, and since then my opinion has only gone down more on it, so I just don't plan on reading the sequel because I'm not interested. Similarly, Coda by Emma Trevane, I really liked the first book, but I read it as a standalone, and the sequel is a spin-off sequel, which I do not plan to read, so I will not be continuing the series. Next up is the one that's going to make everyone mad, and that is Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I've said this a few times recently, but I read this back in middle school when the books were coming out, and I read the first 3 before the 4th one came out, and I have never continued the series, and at this point I don't think I ever will. A lot of people say to finish the Percy Jackson series so you can move on to other Rick Riordan series that are better and more interesting, but I don't really want to read those either, so I think that I'm done with Percy Jackson. Next up, we've got another comic series, and that is Saga. Again, this is one that's gonna hurt a lot of people. I liked Saga. It and Giant Days were my 2 favorite comic series that I read. I just am not super into comic series. I didn't really love it that much, and I don't care enough to be that invested in it. Honestly, I don't even know what volume they're on now. I don't care anymore. Next up is another comic series, and that is Ghosted, which I got at a comic shop in Oxford, and I really didn't enjoy the first volume. I unhauled it a few years ago. I have not thought about it since, and I do not plan on continuing the series because I was very underwhelmed. The next one, another comic series, is Chew. I liked the first volume of Chew. It was actually probably up there with Saga and Giant Days, but I wasn't invested enough to commit to buying a bunch of volumes, and my library didn't have all the volumes, so I just decided to set it down, and since then I've kind of lost interest in it, and once again, as I've said many times, comics aren't really my thing, so I just don't plan on ever continuing the series. Next up is Lumberjanes, which was really disappointing for me because I thought the art style was so cool, and I thought the cast of characters was really awesome, but I just didn't really enjoy the story, and I think I read the first 2 volumes of this and then lost interest. Like with all the other comics I've been talking about, I read these 4 years ago and never continued them, so my memory is foggy. The last comic on this list, I think, is Preludes and Nocturnes. This is one that I'd heard great things about, but I did not really enjoy it, so I got rid of the volume and I don't plan on continuing the series. Moving on to a couple of manga, the first of which is Devil's Line. I read this for the Booktubeathon back in 2017, and the prompt was to pick a book solely based on the cover and read it. And this is why I don't read books based on the cover, because I did not enjoy this. It was about vampires, it was kind of Twilighty, and I did not enjoy that, so I decided not to continue the series. Next up is another manga about vampires, and that is Vampire Knight. Now, I haven't totally given up on Vampire Knight. I think I'm going to try watching the anime because I liked the first volume of Vampire Knight. I just wasn't intrigued enough or invested enough to actually continue the series, but I will consider watching the anime. Next up is The Forgetting, which, like some other books on this section of the list, I read as a standalone. I enjoyed it as a standalone, and then it got a sequel that I don't care about, that I'm never going to read, that I don't intend to read. So in my mind, The Forgetting is just gonna stay a standalone. Next up is Off to Be the Wizard. I read this because Lindsay Ray really enjoyed this series, and I liked the first book, but not enough to continue the series. After I read book 1, there were still a few months when I was kind of intrigued to continue, but past that, I just have not been interested in continuing the series, and I don't think I ever will. I just looked at my list, and we're now about to get into some of the more popular books on this section of the list, so prepare yourselves, the tea is incoming. Next up is the Tearling trilogy, which I read the first book of, Queen of the Tearling. I liked book 1, I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, but I waited too long between reading the first and second book and completely lost all interest in the series. I unhauled all the books, and I'm never going to continue it at this point. Next up is Falling Kingdoms, which I read the first book of for a reading vlog where I was reading the first books in popular YA series. At the time I gave it 3 stars because I liked it, I thought it was all right, but I wasn't blown away by it. And at this point, I think I might bump it down to 2 out of 5 because I just really wasn't impressed at all. It was fine. I just was not compelled in any way, shape, or form to continue the series. So I unhauled all the books, and I definitely don't plan on reading any of the other ones in the series. Next up is The Iron Trial. Honestly, I don't even know how many books are out in this series or if the series is finished. I have no idea. I read the first book 4 years ago, I think, at this point, and it was all right. I liked it, but I really just fell out of interest in the series, and I don't plan on continuing it, and I think I unhauled the copy of the book that I had. Next up is the series that everyone absolutely loved when I joined BookTube, and that is the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness. I feel like a broken record at this point. I read the first book 4 to 5 years ago, and I thought it was all right, but I just did not care enough to continue on, and I've since unhauled the series. This next one is possibly my most unpopular opinion on this list, and that is Vicious. Vicious is one of those books that like everyone on BookTube loves, and the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy is one that a lot of people really love, and I thought they were both just alright. I think I just don't really click with V.E. Schwab as a writer. Plus, again, when I read Vicious, it was a standalone. I read it as a standalone. I don't know what the second book is, if it's like a spin-off or just a sequel. No idea. I don't care enough to find out, and I'm not going to read it. Next up is one that I totally forgot about for years, and that is the Giver series. I never had to read The Giver in school. I just read it during undergrad out of sheer curiosity, and I liked it. It was all right, but I wasn't super compelled or invested in it. I know it's a childhood favorite for a lot of people, but I read it when I was like 19. And yet again, I liked it, but I wasn't compelled enough to continue the series, so I never did and I never will. Next up is the Miss Peregrine series. I read the first 2 books of this. I thought the first one was all right. I liked the second one, but I was not interested enough to continue on in the series, and so I never did. I honestly don't even know how many books are out in the series at this point. Like, I thought it was supposed to be a trilogy, but I think I saw a 4th book. Is there a 5th one too? I don't know. And finally on this list is, of course, the Shatter Me series, which I would like to point out, at one point I had completed it. I read the trilogy and the novellas, but now it is a 6-book series, and it is no longer a completed series for me. And as I've said many times on my channel, I don't like the Shatter Me trilogy. I really disliked book 1. I have no idea why I continued on to book 2 and 3, which I thought were just all right. And at this point, now that I know for sure that I dislike all of them, I'm never going to read another 3 books that I know I will dislike. So after all that, those are all the series that I have started and have not caught up to or finished, and whether or not I plan to continue those series. Looking at the list, I think there are about 10 in the definitely finished category and another like 8 to 10 in the never say never category, which isn't too bad. I think that's a manageable amount, especially given that only 10 of them are ones that I definitely want to finish. Honestly, at this point, who knows? 4 years from now, I could make another video like this and I would have completed all of those series, or I could have completed none of those series. I just don't know. But at this exact point in time, these are my thoughts and feelings on whether or not I will be continuing all of these series. So that's it for this video. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these series that I talked about today and what you thought about them. Do you like them? Do you dislike them? Let me know. Links to all my social media, especially Goodreads, will be down in the description. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I'd love to be friends with all of you there. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!